Prince Harry's autobiography Spare has leaked, and it seems jam-packed, full of surprising revelations. Now, they include drug taking, a physical fight with his brother, the future king, and the circumstances in which he lost his virginity. But perhaps the most incendiary claim was about the number of people he killed when fighting in Afghanistan. Now, in the book, he writes this: "Most soldiers don't know exactly how many kills they have to their credit. Under battle conditions, you often fire indiscriminately. However, in the age of Apaches and laptops, everything I did in the course of 2 tours of duty was recorded and time-stamped. I could always tell exactly how many enemy combatants I had killed, and it seemed essential for me not to be afraid of that figure. Among the many things I learned in the armed forces, one of the most important was to be accountable for my own actions. So my number, 25. It was not something that filled me with satisfaction, but I was not ashamed either. Naturally, I would have preferred not to have that figure on my military resume or in my head, but I would also have preferred to live in a world without the Taliban, a world without war." He goes on, "It wasn't a statistic that filled me with pride, but nor did it make me ashamed. When I was plunged into the heat and confusion of battle, I didn't think about those as 25 people. You can't kill people if you see them as people. In truth, you can't hurt people if you see them as people. They were chess pieces taken off the board, bad guys eliminated before they kill good guys. They trained me to other them, and they trained me well." Now, Prince Harry was a helicopter fighter pilot in Afghanistan, so it's perfectly possible he could have killed that many people over the course of his 2 tours in Helmand. Much of the UK reaction to the revelation hasn't been about the dead or about the war itself, though. Instead, media pundits have been more concerned about whether Harry should have revealed the fact at all, and how it makes the army look. Speaking to BBC Breakfast, this is Colonel Richard Kemp.
My greatest concern is this impression he gives about the British Army kind of looking at their enemy as subhuman. And he makes the suggestion that you can't kill somebody if you regard them as human. Of course, that's complete nonsense. And it is a shame in many ways, because he's a very brave man who went to Afghanistan voluntarily, had to fight the government policy to get there, and had a fantastic reputation for his courage in action and also for the way he championed wounded soldiers. And I think this, to an extent, tarnished that reputation.
Some in Afghanistan, though, have lauded Harry's admission. Senior Taliban leader Anas Haqqani posted this on social media: "Mr. Harry, the ones you killed were not chess pieces. They were humans. They had families who were waiting for their return. Among the killers of Afghans, not many have your decency to reveal their conscience and confess to their war crimes. The truth is what you've said. Our innocent people were chess pieces to your soldiers, military and political leaders. Still, you were defeated in that, quote, game of white and black, quote, square. I don't expect that the ICC, so the International Criminal Court, will summon you or the human rights activists will condemn you because they are deaf and blind for you. But hopefully these atrocities will be remembered in the history of humanity." Aram, I'm not sure that Prince Harry realized this was going to be the sort of excerpt from his book that would get the most attention, but it has, I think, probably quite rightly. What do you make of him writing in his book that he killed 25 Afghans?
Well, there's a reaction to it online, which is a bit incongruent with what I've seen in terms of the quotes. So you've said things there which obviously are appalling. I mean, it's appalling. It's obviously appalling. We were an army. Britain had an army of occupation in Afghanistan. We shouldn't have been there. Important to say, big difference between Iraq and Afghanistan from a legal standpoint. Iraq was, I think most sensible people at the time said, an illegal war of aggression. Afghanistan had multilateral buy-in, UN resolutions and whatnot. So different in that regard. I mean, I think they're broadly the same. I think there were wars of occupation. I think if you're going to somebody's country and killing people, I think you're generally in the wrong. But what he said was interesting about the dehumanization of the people he was killing, because that was basically it's a precursor to being an effective soldier. And the soldiers I've spoken to, that's what they say. I mean, so it's not really in keeping with what Richard Kemp was responding with. Effectively, they viewed their training as soldiers, as service personnel, and of course, not every veteran or serving soldier agrees with this, but this is what they said to me, that they view it as a form of brutalization, and that effectively it's a form of trauma, and it's you have to internalize a certain set of traumas in order to be a quote unquote good soldier. And one of the features of that is being able to dehumanize your enemy, because of course it's very difficult for a human to randomly kill a stranger they've never met. That is quite hard. It's an honest statement. I think it's so honest, of course, it takes you back, because these aren't the things that we're told about what happened in Afghanistan. We think that our our service personnel were over there, of course, and they were, reading, teaching the alphabet to Afghan girls and digging water wells and, making the country a fantastic place. And that isn't what war is. We're trying to pacify a country as large as Afghanistan with tens of millions of people. There's going to be lots of violence. And so I think that's what's most notable about this, is that Prince Harry is being quite candid about the level of violence and about how a lot of the training that goes into it involves people having to lie to themselves and lie to one another. Clearly, all manner of barbarity happened over in Afghanistan as a result of the war. Now, people can say it wasn't a legitimate regime, the Taliban are awful, so we have to get rid of them. Okay. And by the way, they're backed up with what I said at the start of this, which was there was a UN resolution to deal with this. And of course, this comes in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks. It is very different to Iraq in that respect. You're an occupying army, and it's a war of occupation. I think, generally speaking, we look at those after 50, 100 years as almost always ethically unacceptable. And I think people will look at Afghanistan in the same way. There's another excerpt, I don't think we're mentioning it here on the show. If we are, my apologies, but I didn't see it in the show notes, where he talks about the word Paki, the P word. I mean, I've been called it, so I think I'm justified in being able to use it. And he says that when he was raised, he didn't view it as racist, obviously a stupid thing to say. But again, people are attacking him for that. And I thought, well, that's actually quite instructive. If what he's saying is true, it's quite instructive that the brother of the future monarch of England, who presently is, Prince William, who will be King William, or he might choose another name, he was raised in an environment where he didn't know that was a racist term. I think that's quite an extraordinary admission. But instead, what we're talking about is the fact that I think to constantly garner public attention, which of course is now what Harry has to do, that's now his job. He's becoming a celebrity. He's going to have to constantly try and get people's attention to stay a high value commodity for the press. He's going to have to reach ever further back into the recesses of his personal life to remain relevant. And that's going to be quite undignified, frankly. But I can see why this did become the main takeaway for the media, because this is actually quite an important snapshot of the British story in the first decade of the 21st century, which was we participated in 2 really significant wars overseas.
What do you make of the claim of him saying that he killed 25 Taliban? I know he's saying that with the degree of technology we have now, you can be fairly sure about what's happened. But can we have any confidence that the 25 people he killed were actually members of the Taliban?
Well, this is one of the great myths about the modern military, with the US, the UK, and others in the advanced countries, where you hear about precision strikes. They're not very precise. I mean, we've heard story after story about quote unquote collateral damage in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Libya, of innocents being killed. It still happens, by the way. There are still, since the United States has left Afghanistan, there are still drone strikes which kill innocent people. This, I think, quite predictably gets a lot less media attention than what the Taliban does, which of course is equally objectionable and outrageous, but we have a lot more control over what our own armed forces do in our name than what the Taliban do. I think there's quite an important distinction there. I think you're right, Michael. And look, this is why Harry needs to be interviewed by Novara Media. We need to get him in a one-on-one with Michael Walker or Ash Sarkar, because those are the kinds of details which I think would be really interesting. Well, you're saying they were Taliban. How do you know? Because, of course, this is another kind of cliche that we heard straight after invasion, all the way through really to the last couple of years. Everybody that the British Armed Forces took on and the United States, they were Taliban. Well, realistically, that's actually quite an amorphous kind of relationship between Afghan general public, particularly outside the larger cities, and the Taliban. That's not, it wasn't this hierarchical organization with a leader pointing people around with incentives and resources, you might sort of view as analogous to an army. That wasn't what it was. There was a national resistance movement going on. I mean, how else do you explain, Michael? How else do you explain the fact that a government which had resources and been installed by the West, had some level of democratic legitimacy too, how else do you explain it falling so quickly if there wasn't a national movement to get rid of it? And of course, we can't say that in the West. It wasn't said in the West. So we were kind of dumbfounded and perplexed. But the reason why it happened so quickly is because there was a critical number of Afghans who didn't want that government there, because there wasn't a functioning rule of law, because the country hasn't really benefited to the extent that was being said after the invasion. So I know these are all very controversial topics in Britain and Europe, right? And what I find really interesting actually with the Afghan stuff is, You see videos of awful things happening in Afghanistan, right? Awful things. Women can't go to university. Appalling. Appalling. And people say, share this video to raise awareness. We occupied the country for 20 years to do that, and it didn't work out. So you have trillions of dollars spent in Afghanistan with an occupying army to bring about certain, that wasn't the primary reason we went there, but certain social shifts, including, for instance, girls in school, women at university, other things too, of course, free press, freedom of association, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You spend trillions of dollars trying to do that, including a military occupation. That didn't work. You think somebody sharing a viral video on Twitter or TikTok is going to make any difference? It really impresses on me this very strange conversation we have about foreign policy in the 21st century. Britain, France, the US, we cannot decide how other countries are run anymore. We can't do it. We can't do it. I mean, it was misguided in the early years of the 21st century. It's utterly delusional in 2023. Personally, I find the candor from Harry, I think it's useful. I saw some responses saying, oh, he's the sort of the hero of the woke millennials, the Anglo-American woke millennials, their avatar is Harry and Meghan, and yet he killed 25 people in Afghanistan. I think that's a very valid point. But I'd far rather he is so honest and candid about the fact that he killed people rather than pretend, he was serving some humanitarian mission, digging wells and showing Sesame Street to 5 and 6 year olds in Afghan schools. That's not the reality of a war of occupation.